You don't have an outline, they're in the back. We're going to do with this next section, kind of like what we did with the last section. It's a 3-chapter section. And so we are going to, tonight, we're going to look at the big picture, get the outline of the section, start talking through it. And then next Wednesday, we'll finish it, God willing. Tonight, this section of Jeremiah is really interesting. Even, you might say, even a little more practical than a lot of Jeremiah. Because these 3 chapters are basically God's analysis of the leadership of Judah, the kings of Judah, during this time period. So the part in Jeremiah where we're picking up is Jeremiah chapter 21. But we're also going to be in Kings pretty extensively as well, so you might want to prepare yourself for that. So while we're opening our Bibles this morning, I do need to pray. So we'll pray, and then I have a question, and we can start talking through this. But let's pray. God, thank you for this night that you've given us. Thank you for this time. God, thank you that your strength is made perfect in our weakness. Lord, focus our hearts, establish us on you, and help us to learn from you. As we look at the sad lives of people that failed miserably, help us not to be smug, help us not to be haughty, and help us to learn from you, to take heed lest we should likewise fall. Bless us and strengthen us through your word tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so the kings during the latter part of Judah, right before the Babylonians come in, during Jeremiah's ministry, are for the most part really bad. They're bad kings, they're bad leaders. And this section, Jeremiah's chapters 21, 22, 23, is all a discussion between God and Jeremiah about these kings. And it's one of the times where leadership is discussed quite a bit in the Bible, especially moral leadership. So I want to start with a question. As always, the hope is that this is a discussion. What are the characteristics? This is a big question, but what are some of the characteristics of a good leader? Like when you're looking at somebody, well, no, I'm not going to start with good. I'm going to say leader. When you're looking at somebody and you're trying to decide, are they a leader for good or bad, what kind of things indicate that a person's a leader? Enthusiasm. So they have to be able to communicate, right? Communicate passion. What are some other things that indicate that a person's, that make a person, might even say make a person a leader? A good follower. So, and Brother Anthony's a little ahead of the curve because we're not talking about a good leader yet, just a leader. Because not all leaders are good. But yeah, for good leaders, a good follower, absolutely. Wisdom, also a requirement for a good leader. What about just a leader in general? What about being the loudest voice in the room? If you're the loudest voice in the room, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Depends. Depends on who you are, what kind of voice you are. Yeah, what's coming out of their mouth. A lot of times, the loudest person in the room, everybody thinks, oh, they're a leader. They might be a bad leader. Something that, especially when you're like a teenager, at least kind of how I grew up, is people will commonly tell you, oh, you're a leader. I see leadership potential in you. You're a leader. And God has taught me over the years that's actually not very impressive. Like, there are a lot of leaders. Leadership, if it's just influencing people, is really pretty simple. Good leadership is difficult. And what we see here is bad leadership. So as we go through this, let's look at some of the characteristics of some of these kings. On your outline is a chart. And this gives you kind of the timeline what we're talking about in these 3 chapters. This story, tonight's story from Jeremiah chapter 21, it picks up right before the Babylonians come in and absolutely annihilate Israel. So far, I've talked about the Babylonian invasion like it's just one thing, but it was more like a series of waves. The Babylonians came in 3 times, and each time they carried some people off. So the Babylonians came in the first time, and they carried off people, including Daniel. The Babylonians came in a second time. They carried off people, including Ezekiel. The first 2 times, they left a lot of people alive. They left a lot of things still standing. The third time they came in, they absolutely just devastated everything. And that third time was during the reign of King Zedekiah. So let's look in Jeremiah chapter 21, verse 1. the word which came unto Jeremiah from the Lord, when King Zedekiah sent unto him Pashur. If you remember the story, Jeremiah gets locked up and beaten. Probably this is a different Pashur, because this is a very different time. It could be the same guy. It's probably a different guy. It's a common name. Sent unto him Pashur, the son of Malachi, and Zephaniah, the son of Manasseh, the priest, saying, Inquire, I pray thee, of the Lord for us. For Nebuchadnezzar, that's the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, maketh war against us. If so be that the Lord will deal with us according to all his wondrous works, that he may go from us. So a long time has passed from Jeremiah chapter 20 to Jeremiah chapter 21. The Babylonians have now invaded 3 times. This is the 3rd time. And Zedekiah is shut up in Jerusalem, and he asks Jeremiah, inquire of the Lord, see if God is going to save us from this. This isn't the main point, but I think it's worth a little bit of an aside. How do you think Jeremiah might be feeling in this moment? Yeah, this might be an I told you so moment. Hopefully Jeremiah is a little better than that, but this is at a point now where Jeremiah's prophecies are being fulfilled, and everybody realizes that this guy's been right all along. Up to this point in the book, Jeremiah has been the crazy guy. He's been the kook, and nobody believes him. Now everybody realizes he knew it all along. And so the 3rd time the Babylonians are coming in, this is going to be bad. Zedekiah asks Jeremiah to inquire of the Lord. And look at the response that Jeremiah gets, the message that he sends to Zedekiah. Would somebody read for us Jeremiah 21, 3 through 6? Okay, so probably not the answer Zedekiah was hoping for. What's the answer? Zedekiah just said Jeremiah, hey, ask God, see if God will fight for us. What did we just find? What did we just hear? God's going to fight against them, which is absolutely terrifying. This is going to go badly. And in order for us to understand why, I want us to look at the reign of Zedekiah, so that we understand why God is doing this. So if you look on your chart, you have the years that they reigned on the left column. You have who they are on the second from left column. You have, whether they're evil or good. Then the next column is the prophets that were active during their reign. And then the final column are cross references in Kings and Chronicles. So let's go to 2 Kings 24. To understand why God is going to fight against Zedekiah. And specifically 2 Kings 24, 17 through 20. I'll go ahead and read it. 2 Kings 24, 17. And the king of Babylon, so who did we just find out? Who's the king of Babylon? It's Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's the king of Babylon. He's the one that's besieging Jerusalem in Jeremiah. That same king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, made Mattaniah, his father's brother, king in his stead, and changed his name to Zedekiah. So this is interesting. So King Zedekiah was actually set up by the Babylonians. At this point, the Babylonians had been in twice. They were running the show. They were trying to set up Judah as like a little franchise. You guys do what we tell you. You pay taxes, and everything will be fine. And so the Babylonians set up Zedekiah as the king. And Zedekiah in verse 18 was 21 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamattuel, the daughter of Jeremiah, different Jeremiah, of Libnah. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. Well, who is Jehoiakim? We're going to find out. But he was an evil king. For through the anger of the Lord it came to pass in Jerusalem and Judah, until he for through the anger of the Lord it came to pass in Jerusalem and Judah, until he had cast them out from his presence, that Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So there's a couple interesting things going on here. Zedekiah was set up by the king of Babylon to be the king, and he rebelled against the king of Babylon. But how did that happen? Why did it happen according to verse 20? Why did Zedekiah get it in his heart to rebel against the king, against Babylon? What do you guys see? Well, he was arrogant. And it says in verse 20 that it was through the anger of the Lord. This is kind of like God hardening Pharaoh's heart. God did something to him to get it in his head he should rebel against Babylon. And because of that, Babylon comes in the third time, and the third time is going to be the worst of the times. Why do you think God did that to Zedekiah? Why did God judge Zedekiah that way? Verse 19 tells us. Was Zedekiah a good king or an evil king? He was evil in the sight of the Lord. Zedekiah is one of the worst kings. He's very, very bad. And what we're going to see, I'll spoil the ending a little bit here, but what we're going to see is that the real difference maker for good leadership is being right with God, is the right relationship with God. And I don't just mean being saved in a vague sense, but I mean walking in practical obedience. All of the leaders that we're going to see tonight lead Israel into really bad places. Not because they're not powerful, they are. Not because they're not influential, they are. They're great influencers. They can easily be the loudest voice in the room. They're leaders, but they're bad leaders because they're not right with God. We're going to see that going through. So Zedekiah is the last of the kings in the list. And God uses this moment to start having a conversation with Jeremiah and with all of Judah about the other kings, about the kings that have come, the last three kings specifically. So the last of the good kings on our list tonight was Josiah. What do you guys remember about Josiah? What are some remarkable things about Josiah? Yeah, he became king at a young age. He led reforms throughout Israel. The law was rediscovered. The high places where the Baals were worshipped were torn down. Do you remember how he died? He died in battle. And there's a real question about whether he should have been in that battle or not. Josiah dies, and it's not entirely clear that he was doing the right thing when he died. We'll get to there when we get to there. But he was, on balance, a good king, one of the best kings. And so as God goes on to describe the kings that have come between Zedekiah and Josiah, look at what he says. In verses, we're going to pick up in Jeremiah 21, verses 7 through 10. This is part of the prophecy to Zedekiah. And afterward saith the Lord, I will deliver Zedekiah, the king of Judah, and his servants and the people, and such as are left in the city from the pestilence, from the sword, from the famine, into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, into the hands of their enemies, into the hands of those that seek their life. And he shall smite them with the edge of the sword, and shall not spare them, neither have pity nor have mercy. Zedekiah is doomed. And unto this people they shall say, and unto this people thou shalt say, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I set before you the way of life and the way of death. That should be red flags and warning bells. That should trigger something. Do you guys remember where that phrase comes up in the Bible? I set before you the way of life and the way of death. There's a place. Yeah. You're way ahead of me, Paul. I was going to say the Old Testament. But in Deuteronomy, as God is delivering the law, he sets before Israel, he says, I'm going to set before you the way of life and the way of death. And there, the way of life is obedience, and the way of death is disobedience. And the same thing is going to be true here. The big picture, the big thing that we see going through this is that being close to God, obeying God, being holy, being upright, that's the characteristic of not only a good leader, but just a person who's going to do well. But this time, the obedience looks a little different. In Deuteronomy, it's obedience to the law. And this time, it's obedience to a hard instruction. What's the hard instruction in verses 9 and 10? He that abideth in the city shall die by the sword, by the famine, by the pestilence. But he that goeth out and falleth to the Chaldeans, that's the Babylonians, that besiege you, he shall live, and his life shall be unto him for a prey. For I have set my face against this city for evil, and not for good, saith the Lord. It shall be given into the hands of the king of Babylon, and he shall burn it with fire. Historically, that happened. During Zedekiah's reign, the third invasion, the temple is destroyed, everything is burned. So what's the way of death here? Stay in the city. And what's the way of life? Yeah, surrender to the Babylonians, which is counterintuitive. You wouldn't expect God to say that to you. But we also just heard God say, I'm fighting against you. I'm actually against you in this war. That's how bad off they are. And so they have to take a very scary, humiliating step of leaving the city, leaving their protection, and surrendering themselves to the Babylonians. That's going to be a difficult thing for them, but that's the way in which they can live. Why do you think God took the city from them? This is basically God taking their home. And I mean, can you imagine that? If you were homeless, if God took your home from you, like how hard that would be. Why do you think God took their home from them? Yeah. Yeah, they had made it evil. The whole place was evil. The temple had become a place of pride. There was all kinds of corruption and compromise. And so God puts them in a position where he says, if you want to live, all these things that you've defiled, all these things that you're so proud of, if you really want to live, you're going to have to leave them behind and walk barefoot out of your city and go as slaves to Babylon. That's a hard thing that God puts them through. But it ultimately is for their good. It's better than the alternative. And so here God starts to talk about leadership again. He goes through this, and as you look at the outline, you'll see that God talks about leadership in the context of the kings, starting with Zedekiah, and then Jehoahaz, and then Jehoiakim, and then Jehoiachin. And so what he's doing is he's working down to Zedekiah. So he's going to start by talking about Jehoahaz in 608, and then Jehoiakim, and then Jehoiachin, and then Zedekiah. Well, he already talked about Zedekiah, so he's not going to do that again. But let's look at 11 and 12. And touching the house of the king of Judah, say, Hear ye the word of the Lord, O house of David. Thus saith the Lord. Okay, so this is God's instruction to kings. What does a good king do? What does it take to be a good king? Or we might broaden this out to talk about leadership generally. What does it take to be a good leader? It's easy to influence. It's easy to be the loudest guy in the room. It's easy to get people to do what you think they should be doing. At least for a moment, what are the characteristics of the good leader in verse 12? What does a good leader do? Yeah. Execute judgment in the morning and deliver him that is spoiled out of the hand of the oppressor. That's what God has been looking for all along from the kings. And that's what they've consistently failed to do. Judgment here is in the sense of like legal judgments. It's fairly applying the law. And in the morning, the idea is like first thing. This is your first priority. This is the first thing you should be doing. Is you should be treating people fairly. You should be applying the law. And also, what else should he be doing? What else should the king be doing in verse 12? They're kind of one and the same, but the second thing deserves a mention. What's the one that is spoiled? What does that mean? It means something different today, 400 years later. If somebody called you spoiled today, it means something totally different. But when they're writing this, to be spoiled means somebody took all your stuff, or you were taken advantage of or something. And so this person who is taken advantage of, what is the king supposed to do? Yeah, deliver him from the hand of the oppressor. This is your job, king. Your job is to do justice and protect the weak. That is your bread and butter. That is your job. And that basic principle of leadership applies to all situations. And so, God has expected that from the house of David and not received it. He goes on to say, He talks about his fury that goes out like fire and burns that none can quench it because of the evil of your doings. Verse 13, behold, I am against thee, O inhabitant of the valley and rock of the plain. This is a poetic way to talk about Jerusalem, saith the Lord. Who shall come down against us? Or who shall enter into our habitation? I will punish you, verse 14, I will punish you according to the fruit of your doing, saith the Lord. I will kindle a fire in the forest thereof, and it shall devour all things round about it. They only know this because of prophecy, but when the Babylonians breach the city for the third time, the Babylonians are going to burn everything. There's a lot of fire in these prophecies for that reason. So if you are a leader, let's say you're in a leadership position, and you want to get God against you, for some insane reason, you want God to fight against you, what kinds of things should you be doing? What does a bad leader do? Yeah, not getting up in the morning. Yeah, not getting up in the morning. But more than just getting up in the morning, when you're like first priority, what should it be? Say again, Micah? Well, yeah, you shouldn't do that. You should not be making other gods. In the context of verse 12, though, it's justice and protection. If you want God to fight against you, be unfair to people. If you want God to fight against you, neglect the needy. Like the proverb says, the person who hears the cries of the poor and plugs his ears will one day cry to heaven and not be heard. A good leader is fair and protects the needy. That is an essential thing that we see. And man, that applies to our life. If you're in any kind of leadership position, that applies to our life. So now Jeremiah is going to deliver a series of messages that have to do with the kings that you see on your chart. The first one that he's going to talk about is Jehoahaz. Picking up in verse, just a second, I think I lost my place a little bit here. Okay, yeah, there we go. So picking up in Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 1, thus saith the Lord, go down to the house of the king of Judah, and speak there this word, and say, hear the word of the Lord, O king of Judah, that sitteth upon the throne of David, thou and thy servants and thy people that enter by these gates. Thus saith the Lord, execute judgment and righteousness. Now, I want you to notice, it's pretty cool in the King James here, if you have a King James, it says, execute ye. This is important. The message that Jeremiah is giving is not to one person. The message that Jeremiah is giving is to the whole class of leaders, like all the kings, all y'all kings, everybody that's in leadership, all the people of the line of David especially. You need to be executing judgment and righteousness, and deliver the spoiled out of the hand of the oppressor, and do no wrong, and do no violence to the stranger, the fatherless, nor the widow, neither shed innocent blood in this place. And so here we have it again, but expanded. What is God really looking for in a leader? Well, you guys tell me. What's God really looking for according to verse 3? Yeah, someone like himself, somebody who's fair, somebody who does justice. Micah says judgment and righteousness. He's right. We already saw the deliverance. The leader should be using their influence to protect those that need protection. Is the way the leader lives their personal life, does that matter? Do no wrong. Why? What about violence? Do no violence to the stranger, the fatherless, nor the widow. What do those three have in common? The stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. They're vulnerable. They're all vulnerable people. Do no violence to them. Neither shed innocent blood in this place. And so in verses 4 and 5, God tells them, if you do these things, you'll live. Kind of a two-ways thing again. For if you do this thing indeed, then shall there enter in by the gates of this house kings sitting upon the throne of David, riding in chariots and on horses, and he and his servants and his people. But if you will not hear these words, well, you guys tell me in verse 5, what does God say? If you don't take this seriously, what's going to happen? Yeah, you'll be destroyed. And on whose authority? Look at what he says. God doesn't say this very often in the Bible. I swear by myself. And that gets to what Miss Betty mentioned, that God is looking for leaders who are like him. He's looking for people that reflect his character. And so he is swearing by his holy character that he will destroy them if they don't take this seriously. And it goes on, and we're going to talk about all this in detail, in more detail next week. But he goes on to describe the destruction to come. And verse 11 is where he mentions the first of the bad kings. So Jeremiah 22:11, he's called here Shalom, or Shalom. This is Jehoahaz. Same guy, different name, Jehoahaz. So, for thus saith the Lord, touching, and I'm just going to say Jehoahaz. For thus saith the Lord, touching Jehoahaz, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. Now, what do we remember? Josiah, a good king or bad king? Good king. Josiah, good king. His son, bad king. Which reigned instead of Josiah his father, which went forth out of this place, he shall not return thither any more. But he shall die in the place whither they have led him captive, and shall see this land no more. And so that's the prophecy spoken over this king, the son of Josiah, the first in a list of 3 bad kings. He's going to leave this place. He's never going to see this land anymore. And if you look in verse 10, God mentions Josiah. He doesn't use his name, but he mentions what happened. Weep ye not for the dead, neither bemoan him, but weep sore for him that goeth away, for he shall return no more, nor see his native country. So who's the guy that will return no more or see his native country? Josiah's dead, so it's not Josiah. Jehoahaz. Jehoahaz, his son. So this is interesting. It's interesting for a few reasons. First reason is God is telling the weeping prophet to not weep, which is just kind of like, okay, don't cry. Don't cry for Josiah, which is odd because Josiah was the last good king. Like the whole hope of the people was on Josiah. And he got a little full of himself, and he started making foreign alliances, and he got in the way of a war between the Egyptians and the Babylonians, I believe, and he got himself killed, and it's probably not necessary at all. He died in the Lord. I'm sure he was saved. And God is telling Jeremiah, don't weep for Josiah. Don't weep for Josiah. Rather weep for his son, the evil king, who's going away captive. So for all the bad stuff that happened to Josiah at his end, Jehoahaz is still worse off. And now God continues on through the list of kings. So from Jehoahaz, we go to Jehoiakim, and let's look at a little bit about him, 2 Kings 23 and 24. We're working our way back up to Zedekiah. So Jehoiakim, 2 Kings chapter 24, verses 1 through 7. At this point, the Babylonians have come in once, and they've already established their authority over Judah. So 2 Kings 24, 1. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant 3 years. And then he turned and rebelled against him. And notice that theme. These guys keep rebelling against Babylon. It's almost like God is using, not almost like, but God is using Babylon as an instrument of judgment. And these arrogant kings keep rebelling against Babylon. The Lord sent against him the bands of the Chaldees, the Babylonian soldiers, the bands of the Syrians, the bands of the Moabites, the bands of the children of Ammon, and sent against them Judah, and set them against Judah to destroy it. And now we see it really explicitly. Who's rounding up this collection of heathens and setting them against Judah? The Lord is doing it. He's rallying all of these people and using them as an instrument of judgment against his people. According to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servants the prophet. Surely at the command of the Lord came this upon Judah, to remove them out of his sight, for the sins of Manasseh according to all that he did, and also for the innocent blood that he shed. Now, do you remember, what did we just see about good leaders? What did good kings do? What did good kings do in terms of innocent blood? They protect it. They don't shed it. But the bad kings, they shed innocent blood. They're violent to people that don't deserve violence. For he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, and Jehoiachin, his son, reigned in his stead. So here we have a typical bad king proceeding with exactly what you're not supposed to be doing as a king. And that's the reason why God speaks a prophecy back in Jeremiah chapter 22 again, verse 13. Woe unto him, so this is Jeremiah 22:13. Woe unto him that buildeth his house by unrighteousness, and his chambers by wrong, that uses his neighbor's service without wages, and giveth him naught for his work. That saith, I will build me a wise house and large chambers, and cutteth him out the windows, and it is sealed with cedar, or like paneled with cedar, and painted with vermilion, a kind of red-orange. Shalt thou reign because thou hast clothed thyself in cedar? God is sort of being sarcastic here to Jehoiakim. He's asking him, are you a king because you have a nice house? Or do you really have authority because of your nice house? How did Jehoiakim get so wealthy? What did he do? Look in verse 13. What did Jehoiakim do? Yeah, he built his house by, not just without righteousness, but by unrighteousness. Jehoiakim's evil made him filthy rich. And some of the specifics for how that happened was he wouldn't pay people according to their work at the end of verse 13. And so this is God's complaint against Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim has made himself rich by being unfair to people. And that is the exact opposite of what a king should do, really any leader. And so he goes on. Our next king is Jehoiakim's son, and we already saw him mentioned in 2 Kings. Probably won't turn there. Jehoiachin. And here in Jeremiah, he's called Coniah. As I live, saith the Lord. So this is Jeremiah 22:24. As I live, saith the Lord, though Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, were the signet ring upon my right hand, yet I would pluck thee thence. And I would give thee into the hand of them that seek thy life, and into the hand of them whose face thou fearest, even to the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hand of the Chaldeans. And I will cast thee out, and thy mother that bare thee, into another country, that ye were not born, and there you shall die. Do you remember the defiled garment? Jeremiah was to take a garment and put it in water and let it get all defiled. And God used that as an object lesson and said, just in the same way you would strip off and throw away this old defiled garment, so I'm going to strip off and throw away Israel, Judah specifically. Well, here we see the same kind of picture, but this time the picture is that the king is like a ring. And if you live in Bible times, what do you use a signet ring for? It's your seal, it's your signature, it's your credit card, it's everything about you. And God is saying, even if you were my signet ring, King Jehoiakim, because you're so wicked, I would take you off and I would throw you away. That's what God does to bad leaders. That's what God does to wicked people in authority. It doesn't matter how powerful they are. It doesn't matter how strong they are. It doesn't matter how influential they are. It doesn't matter what results they get. In the end, if you're not right with God, you cannot be a good leader. And so chapter 23, and we're not going to go into details at all on chapter 23, but do read it for next time, because next time we will work through this in more detail. Chapter 23 speaks about evil leaders and also about the Messiah. The Messiah is set up as a kind of antidote or a good leader to all these evil leaders. But let's wrap it up practically tonight. That's the big 1,000-foot view of the next 3 chapters, and next week we'll work through them in detail. All 3 chapters are about kings, about God's judgment of kings. And so I started this by asking the question, what is a good leader? What's a leader and what's a good leader? I'll ask this question now. What is God looking for in a leader? What does good leadership look like from God's perspective? What have you guys seen? Righteousness. So, holiness of conduct, Sagan. Obedience. Obedience to who? Yeah, obedience to God. So righteousness, and that gets to being a good follower. If you're not learning to be an obedient follower of God, you can't expect to influence others rightly. What else? What about when God gives you authority? Whether it's authority over kids, authority in the workplace, authority in a church. When God puts you in a position of authority, what's he looking for? Yes, yes. Yeah, you should not be killing the people that are, hopefully that's not common in your workplace, but yeah, well, or just not, I think, actually, Sarah, I think you said it well, is not be quick to shed blood. I'm thinking about the broader category of like being abusive as a leader. There are a lot of abusive leaders. There are a lot of bullies. I really get angry. Bullies really make me angry. The pastor should not be given to violence, but man, bullies make me angry. Good leaders should not be physically, emotionally, or verbally abusive. And in the most extreme sense, they shouldn't be shedding innocent blood. They shouldn't be applying pressure to people who don't deserve pressure. What else? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, being consistent, being fair. And in order to do that, in order to fairly, consistently apply the law, you have to know the law. That's one of the reasons why when the kings were set up, God said to them, when you become king, you have to write out your own copy of the law. And you have to study it. And that's important. We have to actually know the standards. And we have to apply them fairly. What else? What's God looking for in a good leader? We see a lot about protecting the helpless, like the widows, the orphans, the spoiled, or in other words, the taken advantage of. How does that apply to our circumstances? Where do we have opportunity to protect those that are not as able to protect themselves? God's children, yeah. From the movie, right? Okay. I have a policy about not recommending movies from the pulpit, but yeah. Yes. So taking that very seriously. That's one of the reasons why, and we're not perfect by any means, but we try hard to have good child worker policies here at Berean, because we do need to protect our children. What else? What do you guys think? Yeah, do you have a... Yes. Do you notice that? Scott really makes a good point. And I'm going to get back to that stepping up when needed. The good leader, what these kings should be like God made fun of Jehoiakim and said, hey, are you a king because you're so rich? Are you a king because you're such a big shot? God expects the kings to be a servant to the people. He expects the kings to apply the law by serving the people by applying the law, to protect the weak, to serve them in that way. God expects his leaders to be servants. He's going to describe them in chapter 23 as pastors, as shepherds. And never been a shepherd of like four-legged sheep, but that's a lot of work. You have to work hard to take care of the sheep. And let's talk a little bit more about the, how did you say it, Sarah, stepping in when needed? Stepping in. So you're in a situation where you have some degree of authority, and you see that somebody else is being taken advantage of. Somebody is being bullied, somebody is being pushed around. If you have authority, what should you do with that authority? You do what's right, which might mean standing up, right? Yes, with the two women, yes. The old saying is that the only thing required for evil men to succeed is for good men to stand by and do nothing. God's not looking for passive leaders. He's looking for active leaders. Now, one of the great acts of wisdom is to balance being active with being humble, using authority but making yourself a servant of people. So that's the big picture of good leadership and bad leadership. And next week we're going to see those things in detail as we go through these 3 chapters. But let's pray. God, thank you. Thank you that you are our example. And we need you so desperately. God, help us to rightly follow you. Help us to use the influence that you give us and the authority that you give us to the right end. Help us not to think more highly of ourselves than we should, but help us to make ourselves servants. Help us to love justice. Help us to seek fairness. Help us to be consistent and not hypocritical. Jesus, you have given us the perfect example to follow. And as we look at how much harm, how many tens of thousands of people died because of leaders that would not follow you, may we be sobered, and may we see the importance of good leadership. Bless us this week in Jesus' name.